To discuss, let's bring in Kamran Bokhari, founding director of the Center for Global Policy, and Kelley Vlahos, executive director at the American Conservative. Welcome to both of you. Kelley, we'll start with you. Do you think that this attack on the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia is really a game changer? Because we have seen attacks by the Houthi rebels on Saudi territory over the past few months. And Saudi Arabia, well, they have responded in Yemen, but probably not as forcefully as they could have. So do you expect to see a major retaliation from Saudi Arabia, maybe even the U.S. against Iran?
I think it might be more likely to see a major retaliation by Saudi Arabia, and I do think it is a game changer. I think whether or not the missiles or the drones were launched from anywhere other than Iran, or they just had the technology, the Houthis had technology delivered to them by the Iranians. I think Iran and the Houthis, their compatriots, are sending a signal that Saudi Arabia, its oil facilities, the Gulf oil facilities, are vulnerable, and U.S. interests in the area, in the region, are vulnerable. So yes, I do think this is a game changer at a time when the United States is trying to put maximum pressure on the Iranians. They're turning the tables and putting their own version of maximum pressure on the Saudis and its U.S. allies.
Kamran, your thoughts here. How far are we from an all-out war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, what Zarif is warning about?
I think the Iranian foreign minister is playing with words. That is to be expected. Iran is playing a weak hand, so they will, engage in chest thumping and their own perception shaping and warning the other side that if they engage in counterstrikes, then it could get ugly. So that's just sort of par for the course. As for an all-out war, the possibility, I don't see that, despite the threats from the Iranian foreign minister. Tehran does not want an all-out war. It will devastate the Iranian economy even further. The Saudis do not want to see any further disruption of oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. The United States certainly does not want an all-out war. That is not in the American interest. What will happen, and I agree this is a game changer, is that there will be some form of retaliation. And then we need to see, what will be the Iranian counter move. Certainly no one wants this to escalate. Can we get from here to the negotiating table anytime soon? Well, that's what I'm watching for, at least.
Kelley, let's touch for a second on the U.S. interest here. If this was the year 1990, such an attack could have had different implications for the United States. But the U.S. nowadays is energy independent. This country no longer relies on oil sources in the Persian Gulf. So what kind of support should the Saudis expect from the United States in this case when, the oil in exchange for security partnership is no longer so relevant, right?
Right. I do think that the relationship is at a crossroads, and what happened last Saturday is really highlighting that. You see the first response from Mike Pompeo being to blame to Iran, to call it an act of war. You hear President Trump talk about being locked and loaded. And now, as your correspondent just reported a few moments ago, they seem to be dialing that back. There seems to be, some space for reflection and possible talks. We've heard Trump go back and forth between tough rhetoric and offering to sit down and start renegotiations on the nuclear deal. I think it's because Trump senses that he doesn't have the full support of the Congress in a war or a military response or even a military aggressiveness towards Iran. He also senses that the American people do not support in a war, a military action with Iran. So I think they're at a crossroads now where they support the Saudi ally in full, but they've supplied weapons and they've supplied support in their war with Yemen. But I don't think that President Trump is willing to go any further than that.
Well, to your point, Kelly, there's a lot of partisanship on Iran and on Saudi Arabia. But Kamran, does it surprise you that so far we haven't really seen a very solid evidence showing that these drones or missiles were launched from Iran's territory? Aren't we supposed to have all eyes on Iran all the time? Or maybe, it doesn't really matter where the attack was launched from, because either way, even if it's the Houthis, Iran is behind.
Yes, I mean, the key question here is that if Iranian officers pull the trigger and from Iranian soil, then that's a game changer, as Kelly was pointing out, because Iran usually operates through proxies. So we're dealing with a far more emboldened Iran. But again, you're absolutely right. We don't have that sort of like slam dunk evidence to say that this is definitely Iran, though it is leaning heavily towards that.
Kamran, I want to ask you really briefly, could it be the IRGC operating without the knowledge of the Iranian government? Theoretically?
I doubt that. I think that the Iranian command and control is very solid. This attack would not have happened without authorization from the highest levels. So, but right. in the end, whether it was the Iranians or somebody else, Iran supplied the technology. Iran is escalating. And if the United States does not respond, that undermines Washington's credibility.
Kamran Bokhari, Kelley Vlahos, thank you both for this fascinating conversation.